Hi, my name's Dominic Grace, Head of London Residential Development at Savills, and a long-time tech fan. I'm really excited actually to be sort of comparing, as it were, today's session, along with Jason Hawthorne from VU.CITY and obviously Daniel from Aprao. And I particularly welcome this because this is an evidence, as it were, of this ecosystem that's so much talked about in the PropTech world, of different tech platforms coming together, and 2 + 2 making well over 6, I would argue, in this case. Anyway, without further ado, I'd hand over to Jason and Daniel to demo all their exciting software. Go, guys.
Thanks, Dom. My name is Jason Hawthorne. I'm Chief Digital Officer at VUCITY and also one of the founders. So today what I'm going to do is give a very quick overview of VUCITY and then look specifically at maybe choosing the site and thinking about what we could do and demonstrate that tech, as Dom suggests, and being able to integrate with the Aprao software as well. So VUCITY, just anybody who's not seen the platform to date, is actually a full digital model of the whole of London. In fact, we have 20 UK cities built now as well. So if you go on the website, you can look at all the cities we have. We commission flights over the cities using stereo pairs of photography. We then actually model the buildings ourselves. So there's no computer algorithms to actually model at this level of accuracy. The accuracy that we work to is 15 centimeters, and that's both on the buildings and also the terrain as well. We do this predominantly because we want to be able to use this model as part of determining change and what change means for our cities. You can see as I move around, it's the city that we've modelled is all of London. Actually, we've modelled out now to the M25 essentially. So 1,617 square kilometres of London is modelled in this high level of detail. And that really is just the starting point. That's been a number of years from building this out. And we run this in a game engine so that it's as fluid to use as we're looking at. But just as lockdown struck, first lockdown, we actually moved onto cloud as well. So you're watching me, if you're seeing a bit of frame rate drop, that's because you're actually watching me stream from cloud to my computer, and then obviously you're looking at my computer. But it's nice and fluid now. It means that we don't have any technology barriers or hardware barriers to be able to run VUCITY. It's very easy for anybody to access under a software subscription license to be able to use. This really is the starting point, of course, and what we want to look at today is thinking, okay, we've got this great model of a city. What does that mean we can do, and how accurate is it rather? So the first thing that we do as a team is we have a curation team whose job it is essentially to make sure that we keep the model up to date. So this timeline, as I'm drawing it forward now, you'll see is bringing forward lots of different coloured buildings. That's essentially the major planning applications that are coming forward in London. We're not complete yet, but we're a long way through. We've got over 2,000 buildings modelled now. And the blue ones represent, or the yellow ones represent major applications that have been given consent. They turn blue when they've been implemented on site. And actually when they're complete, they go into this dark grey colour here. So, and the dark grey reminds us when we refly, which we'll do every 3 years, that we just established that was the as-built as a sort of final element to what we're doing and updating the model. We've got lots of tools that we can use in VUCITY. We've got sunlight, we can move the sun through the model. We've got measurement tools that we can look at heights. But what I want to do today, rather than take you through all of the sort of determining tools that we've got and show you everything we've built, is really start to think about, well, what does this mean if we were to look at a development site coming forward, which is obviously then how we start to link with the Appraisal software that Daniel will talk to you and show you shortly. So I took the liberty earlier of just looking at the site. It's completely random, so apologies if anybody looks at this and thinks, oh, you've inadvertently clicked on something we may be looking at. There's absolutely no reason to choose this site other than the fact that I wanted to look at the potential maybe of an area that you might think, well, that might be right for development, for instance. So what I've done here is we can look at a building, and I've just got this one centered here. The first thing we can do is we can actually click on that building and highlight it and then hide it. So we can hide a site. So we've hidden this site now. The reason I chose this, I was just looking earlier and thinking, well, it's got quite a lot of high buildings around it. I wonder if we could get more height on this site and whether or not that would be pertinent to build. And then we have create tools in here. So really quickly, you can then start to click on any given space and build something new. So just to show you this and how this works, and then you can extrude. So very quickly we could start to think, right, okay, we'll put a new tower on here, and maybe that would be suitable in this area. Of course, what we really want to do is assess whether any of these things are feasible or not. So there's a number of tools that we can start to look at and see whether or not what we're looking at would make any sense. The first is that we have all of the London View management framework built into the model as well. So if I turn all of this on, we can actually see these are all the protected views to St. Paul's and Houses of Parliament. And this shows us all the views across London that are protected because of those heights. Now, you'll see the tower that I've just selected, actually, the first thing that's going to cause me an issue is that caps the height that we could build to. I can see immediately that I'm going to have issues here because I'm in the viewing corridor. Just to show you how this would work, if we looked at, rather than show them all, let's just look at this one, which is from Alexandra Palace. If I drop out and we go to the actual viewpoint here, just take a moment for the model to catch up and the streaming to catch up because I've jumped all the way out to Alexandra Palace. What this is doing, building that view out now with the model all the way to from Ali Pali to look at St. Paul's. These are actually, we've surveyed all the photographs and we've taken the photographs from each of those viewpoints. So this is actually the image taken looking across the St. Paul's. You see, it's actually quite hard to define St. Paul's, but if I come to the other end here and fade the photograph out and we look at the model, we actually start to see the viewing corridor here. But you'll see this tree is in the way. So I can go to the trees and I can then turn the leaves off as well. So we can now look at this viewpoint without the leaves. It's slightly apocalyptic in terms of all the trees now with no leaves on, doesn't look quite as it would. But the trees, when we create the model, are also captured to their height and their canopy width to give us a level of accuracy to determine whether they're part of views or not. So this is why turning the leaves off is really helpful because we can start to think about those winter views. And what we see here, if I start to zoom into this viewing corridor, is you can now clearly see the building that I've been extruding and why it's going to cause an issue because it's right in the way of this viewpoint to St. Paul's. So going back to those protected views, let's just jump back and turn that off and come back to the model. The first thing we can do then is say, well, okay, if we're creating this, then maybe what we need to do is to think about the height of what we've just established. So I can then pull this model back down till I'm sitting comfortably underneath the LVMF viewpoint. And you'll see here it also captures the building's GEA. So let's just turn the viewing corridor off now because we know we're safe underneath the viewing heights. We might also want to think then about if we are building a scheme such as this, where could we see it from? So what are the visual impacts in the immediate neighbourhood? So we've built directly into the platform the zone of theoretical visibility. So what this allows me to do is essentially to say, rather than select views randomly on the ground or at viewpoints that we think we might be able to see it, in actual fact, where can I see this scheme from? Now I'm going to run this quite quickly at a low granularity, but you can see here, we can do this up to 2 square kilometers within the platform. In fact, any user could do this. And you can change the resolution on the ground from 10 meters down to 1 meter squares. I'm just going to run this, as I say, fairly loosely in terms of first pass. Now this ZTVs used to take days to do this, running some fairly powerful computers. We're now taking advantage of the GPU software to be able to generate these. And you see now here it goes, it's running the ZTV in the background, which essentially means that what used to take many hours to create and a significant cost, we can actually run those ZTVs now and directly into VUCITY, and it will then establish, as we look, we can see the tower is then graded for color, and what it then does is start to drop on the ground where we can see the tower from. So ZTV is a really important tool to be able to determine what we can and can't see. When you've done that, you can then create canvas studies. So we can then select and we can choose our building here. Again, I'll just do this as a quick test. Select the building, and then from there we can start to add cameras. So we could then say, well, we know we're going to take some of these immediate views from down the street here. I wonder whether or not we could see it from within this park up here as well. So dropping down to ground, I've now got my viewpoint. I could go back to the model as well. And we could turn leaves back on so it doesn't look quite so bad, but there's the winter view and there's the summer view. Obviously makes a big difference in this location, sitting at street level, being able to see this. And again, the nice thing here is we can start to determine which of these views would be necessary as part of the town and vision impact statement, and how much work we would then do in terms of verifying these viewpoints. So the one that I selected in the park there, and you'll see the little map in the corner shows you where I was in the park. Actually, what this is showing is that from that park, it would be impossible to see the building. So where previously we might have gone and determined and done a viewpoint and surveyed it at expense, we can now know that actually there's no necessity to go to this particular park and take this viewpoint, at least in the location we're in. You can move around, so it's possible to still move, but obviously if I come closer, in this case, I'm going to see a less chance of seeing the building than otherwise. And you can change everything in here. So let's go back to this view where I can see it. You can change the actual camera position and location, the pitch. It's set immediately at 1.6 meters above ground, which is the determining height that we would usually use for verified views. So now we've got a position where we understand maybe the limits in terms of heights and views, but also we might want to think about other layers of data before we pass this across as a viable option, shall we say, to think about costs and things. We can run a land reg query, so we could query immediately actually the ownership of the site, and I'll just do this quickly. If we just click on, I'll click on another building rather than my test building. You see here now it's actually giving me a red line poly for this entire site, and if I click here, it will give me the details on that. So this is a freehold. Looks like it's owned by Islington here. So that's a really nice way, means of looking at the site, and we can turn buildings on and off within that red line boundary as well. We might also want to think about listed buildings. So we've got links to Historic England data, and you can click here and it will give us the data here on, for instance, the nearest listed buildings. So in this case, there's looks like there's a public house, a pub just across the road. We could look at local plan data. We can look at planning data as a whole in terms of conservation areas and greenbelt. So again, useful to just be able to see those. And I can see now we are within a conservation area here. So that's something we might want to be taken account of. We could also look at transport data, things like, well, what would be the PTAL rating, so the accessibility to public transport. And I can see here we're in the kind of orange zone, so obviously quite good transport links from here. And if we wanted to see how that sits actually with the TfL network, if I zoom out, we can then see there's the network, and this is the geographic location of the network rather than the tube line we're all used to seeing when we're on the underground. If there are TfL cameras in the area, we have links to the TfL cameras. I'm not sure that there's any sitting here at the moment. Let me see if I can find a couple just to show. So this is just showing that we could link to live data as well. So that's quite useful if there was then to be live data around the site we wanted to integrate with, we can do those things too. But finally, just before I pass across to Daniel, what we really wanted to do then was to say, okay, maybe we want to optimize the site a little bit more than maybe what I've created here. So let me just turn off that land reg query layer. Let's just delete this now to get rid of that red line boundary. So that was my first tower, and it gave me an idea of height, but obviously I'm not really optimizing the site. So what we then might want to think to do is to create a number of schemes, for instance. So if I turn off this and turn off the camera studies, we're back to our cleared site. The two buildings that I was just extruding and playing with earlier. So these are all saved. You can save these within your project. So every time you come back, you can come straight back to the building and location that you maybe produced previously. So just a couple of different options essentially of what we might be able to look at and build on site. If we look at this first one now, what I did here was just change some of the floor heights. So each of these floor heights is possible to change individually, and you can push floors back. But what I thought we could do today is just look at if we were to essentially have this as more a commercial space at ground floor, for instance, then it would be useful to think that we could have more height at the ground. So when I was doing this earlier and I ran this, you can see we have GEA. That's actually all of the buildings I've got here created. So if we just delete these, we're just left with one building. We can then look at that one building and determine a GEA, and now I've changed it from what I was going to pass to Dan because I've added a floor. There we go. So actually, if we then knew, having qualified all of this from all of the different ideas of its impacts on surroundings, and maybe even working with our other partners, GEA, where we could look at GIA, beg your pardon, where we could look at impacts on neighbouring properties from daylight and sunlight, we could actually hopefully get to a point where we say, okay, this is about the right volume of a scheme on this site. So not getting into the detailed design, but saying how big is this building that we could do here. So we take this reading here of 10,706 square meters of GEA, which is equivalent to about 115,000 square foot. And at that point, what I'll do is I'll hand over to Daniel so that he can then share his screen and show you what the Appraisal would do once they've got that result. Over to you, Daniel.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jason. Really impressive piece of software there. So yeah, so I'm Daniel Norman. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Appraisal, and we've built a financial modeling tool, which I'm going to show you now how we can take that kind of information from VU.CITY and actually look at the financial viability of that site and also calculate a residual site value. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, so here we go. So in front of you now is the Appraisal dashboard. So this is a place where in our software you can organize all of your projects. Each one of these cards represents a project, and within that we store the appraisals or the financial feasibility studies. So I created a template. Jason and I were chatting yesterday. He told me that we're going to be working on a site as an example, and this was the postcode. So I've just popped that in. This is my project screen, summary information, a mixed use site, ground floor commercial with some open market and affordable resi. I've got a few templates that I work in Appraisal. We let you set up your own templates so that you can use a format of financial model that you're used to working in. So this template that I've set up here will give me the ability to make a very quick high level appraisal of this site and calculate a residual site value. So the first thing that I'm going to do before going into this in more detail is setting the target return. So we're going to look to target a return on cost of 30% on this development. And this is typical for a unconsented site or a conditional purchase like this. So we're going to work on this basis. I'm going to give this appraisal a title. So I'm just going to call it an initial appraisal. But you can give that a description of whatever you wish and give it a further summary if you would like to do so. The first thing I'm going to do in the appraisal itself now is build out the sales or the accommodation schedule. So in Appraisal, we can do a full detailed breakdown, but for this purposes, I'm going to keep things relatively high level. So we've got a mix of private residential and affordable residential. Now, Jason was working in square meters, and in the appraisal stage and in the development stage, most of us are used to working in square foot. So we've taken the area of 10,000 square meters as the GA from Jason, and we've applied that to square feet, and very nicely, almost perfectly, is roughly about 110,000 square foot. So what we're going to do, that was over 11 floors as well. So we're going to start with 10,000 square foot of retail on the ground floor or commercial. We can rename this as we wish. So I've put my 10,000 square foot here into the commercial. We can set a rent per square foot which generates an annual rent. We can look at rent-free periods and yields, and that capitalizes that back to a capital value. We can easily make adjustments in Aprao, which will have a knock-on effect on all of these elements. So I can change the yield, and you can see what the value, how that affects the value. We also factor in things like the leasing costs and the associated costs with the disposal. So these are just the assumptions within my template, but you can easily change these either by changing the amount in pounds or changing the percentages. So I'm going to come back over. We've got our ground floor commercial of 10,000 square foot. I'm going to jump over to the residential. We've got private residential. We're going to assume a 70-30 split between private and the affordable. And within the affordable, we're going to actually blend the tenures within that. So we've got some assumed pounds per square foot on values for the private residential and the affordable. And on a 70-30 split on the remaining 100,000 square foot, we're going to have 70,000 square foot of private residential, and we are then going to have a further 30,000 of the affordable residential. So now what we've got is our residential all within this unit type here, where we've got the agent's fees and legal fees on the disposal. We can tweak those accordingly as well. And then when I collapse that, we can see we've got the total saleable area, or the NIA here, of 110,000 square foot, the GDV, the sales costs, and the net development value. So the next thing I'm going to do is jump over to the build cost. We can put in things like preliminary costs, and this is all completely customizable, so you can have as many line items as you want. I've just got a few examples in there for today. And then in the build cost, what we're going to do is apply a build cost. We've assumed £250 per square foot, which would be typical for a development of this type of scale in this type of location. I'm going to take the area. This figure here is coming from the sales information. So I can literally bring that into my appraisal by clicking apply. I can set a gross to net ratio, or net to gross ratio, which just by using this percentage here. And then because I'd already set £250 per square foot for the build cost, that then automatically will generate the build cost here of £30 million, just over. We've got a contingency in here as well of 10%. We can easily tweak that, and we can add in as many build phases into the mix as we want here. As this comes together, we can also view our key metrics on the project. They don't really make that much sense until we've got all of the information in and the site purchase, and that's why I was keeping this closed. But we can also always view a summary appraisal, which is live. So every tweak that we make real time will update that summary appraisal, so you don't need to jump around between screens or tabs to get that calculated. So over in our other costs here, we've got some professional fees. We've assumed these at 10% of the build contract value. Again, you can go as granular as you want and have as many line items within here, change the names and customize this to suit your way of working. But for today's purposes, we'll keep it high level. And we've also got some statutory costs. So we've assumed a SIL and Section 106 of roughly about £5,000 per unit, and working backwards at about 750 square foot per unit on average. That's about 130 units. So we've arrived at £650,000 as a SIL and Section 106 contribution. Now, what we're going to do here is look at the finance. And with the finance, we can go into a lot of detail in Aprao, but we've just taken some assumptions here. So we've said 65% of total costs will be our senior debt loan. We are calculating interest on the drawn balances. We're estimating a loan term of 36 months, which is our expected term for the project. And Aprao will automatically calculate an S-curve over the life of the project, and that is generating an estimated interest figure of £1.8 million. We've also got some commitment fees and exit fees in of 1% in and 1% out on the loan. When you are going into a more detailed appraisal, you can actually generate an accurate interest figure from the cash flow. But for today, we're not going to be doing a cash flow on this project, so we're using our quick interest estimation tool, which is here. Now, moving on to the site purchase, because this is why we are doing this process, to arrive at a residual site value. So here is our site purchase costs. So Appraisal is very clever. It will look at your legal fees, any agents fees. I've assumed 1.5%, but if we're dealing with Savills, it might be something more like this. But for today, I'll keep it at 1.5%. And then it will also look at the existing use class and automatically calculate the stamp duty, and that arrives back to a net residual value. So here what we've got is £28 million, which I can bring in like this. And now what you can see is that the key metrics start to make sense. So we've got our 30% return on cost, which was our target. We can see our return on GDV and our return on equity here. If you do a cash flow, this will generate the IRR for the project and the equity IRR as well. So I'll just collapse that, and you can also see here, we've got our summary appraisal showing our target profit and our actual profit. Why do we have two profit figures? Well, we've obviously set our residual site value at 30% return on cost here. But let's just say for a second that the landowner was actually selling the site for £35 million. So it's on the market for £35 million. I can put that in here as a purchase price. And what we then show in red is that you're making £13 million profit, which on the face of it isn't bad, but your target profit is 23 million. So we highlight that in red because we say it's falling short of where your target is in order to achieve that residual value. So this is a very useful tool. If someone's offering a site, you're able to have a look at it, understand how much you should be paying for that site, and therefore make quick offers or quick decisions on whether or not you should or should not be moving forwards with a site. So now that I've done that, we can do a couple of things. So first of all, we've got that figure, the all-important figure of how much we can afford to pay for this site, the residual site value. But Aprao also produces a report like this, where without doing any further work or formatting, we put together a full feasibility report, which looks at all of the key financial metrics, as well as a nifty aerial view of the site that we've got here that's driven from the address. We've got a summary financial appraisal, which covers all of the key data points that any stakeholder is going to want to see in a summary one-page view. But then we also go down into a lot more detail. So we've got a revenue breakdown section. I'll also share a link of this afterwards so you can look at it in your own time. We've got the site purchase information, the build cost information. We've got our other costs, finance, and then finally, we've also got a sensitivity analysis. So this looks at what happens if the GDV goes up or the GDV goes down on the project, and what happens if the build costs go up or the build costs go down. It's a really nice way to see a heat map of the strength of this particular opportunity. So this report can be exported as a PDF with company logo on it, or you can also share this report with somebody by going back to the dashboard and sharing a report using link-based sharing, which is a great way to share projects, because the person receiving it can also save a copy of that to their Aprao dashboard. So the final thing I'm going to show you today is just as an example, how we can quickly run versions of numbers. So we've assumed in this site here that we've got residential and commercial split. But let's just say for a second, we were considering looking at this as a commercial development purely, or a resi and commercial, to understand what the effect would be on the profit and the residual value. So let's not forget our residual value was £28 million. So what I can then do is come back over to our project screen, very quickly create a copy of that appraisal. So this is our copy. I can rename it to commercial only. And then in the sales section, what I can do is I can actually remove the two residential unit types. In fact, I can just delete them altogether. And in the commercial, I can take this up to 110,000 square feet. So we've now got our 110,000 square foot. We've got our our gross development value here, and that will then feed through. We may want to change the build cost. It might be lower spec than obviously if it was residential. We can make those adjustments, but very quickly we can jump back to the site purchase information. And here you can see that if it is a commercial building, we could actually look at a slightly different residual value. And then very quickly, what we've got is two versions of the feasibility report, which we can look at side by side, comparing those two different scenarios. And we can also view them here in the dashboard, understanding the differences in those, and actually make a quicker, faster buying decision on what we should be looking at. So that was a very quick, high-level run-through of Aprao. We're going to be doing some Q&A coming up soon, and I'm now going to hand back over to Dominic.
Thanks, Daniel. Fascinating, and we've had a few questions, and Daniel, are you fielding questions from the audience? I saw someone did put one up, and we've got one here. Well, let's kick off with this one. When sharing your project appraisal, does the recipient have to have a Aprao membership to gain? And then I can't see the rest of it, but I think probably, yeah, it was a question we chatted about it when we were rehearsing this, as to perhaps how Aprao and VUCITY moving forward might, you know, facilitate some sort of sharing of your subscriptions. This is looking ahead, so that someone can, you know, jointly use these systems, as you've so effectively demonstrated. So
I can see Owen's question there. It's slightly different, but so I'll answer Owen's question first, and I will also tie in with what Dominic was saying there. So Owen's question was, when sharing your project appraisal, does the recipient have to have an Aprao membership to gain access? The simple answer is no. Anybody, when you're sharing by link, anybody can view a read-only version, web-based version of that, or save that as a PDF. If somebody wants to have edit the numbers or play around with a version of that, they can't touch your original appraisal, but what they can do is sign up to a free trial of Aprao and save a copy onto their own dashboard to play around with that. So that's a really useful way of sharing project appraisals. Coming back to what Dominic was saying, today we manually took that area from VUCITY and applied it into Aprao, but in the future we're looking at ways where we can work together to potentially integrate the systems to allow that number to come across, so we can look at real-time appraisals as you're affecting and adjusting the design of a potential building or the massing of a building. We can look at the effects and what that could mean on your residual value, essentially having a live residual value based upon your assumptions.
Thanks, Daniel. And I've come off earphones because I had a note that some people were struggling to hear me. So hopefully they can hear me a bit better now through the mic on my laptop. Good. Somebody's kindly said yes. We also had a question earlier on from, I think it was Lucy, about sustainability overlays, you know, in terms of assessing the sustainability of the site. And it prompts a bigger question perhaps to Jason around what other data you guys either now or looking ahead might expect to be overlaying on top of the VUCITY platform.
Yeah, absolutely, Dom, thank you. At the moment, we have some layers of data that speak to sustainability. So we have things like air pollution, and we have flood risk and others. A lot of work is going into also the kind of whole microclimate analysis of the impacts of buildings. So thinking about CFD, wind analysis, maybe determining factors such as sunlight hours on the ground. So there's a lot of work being done at the moment to either add in more functionality from others, and I mentioned GIA in terms of thinking about daylight and sunlight, but on that much more sort of global vision of cities, absolutely. I mean, we can ingest data, both at heat maps or point data. So it's not necessarily that we would do the engineering piece directly within VUCITY, but being able to determine and look at those results across city scale, I think is really important. And another sort of obvious example that springs to mind is traffic analysis, for instance. So the data that is provided by traffic engineers, usually coming out in the form of vision or panoramics data, we can actually put that directly into VUCITY, so we can see numbers of vehicles down the streets or street flows. When you then look at that with air pollution, of course, then you start to see and understand the impacts of the amount of vehicles in a given space versus air pollution. So absolutely, it's firmly, it's already starting to appear within our data sets, but we've got a lot more to do as well.
And I mean, in terms of those who might be, you know, watching who are, you know, from one of the existing professions who've got their own very established ways of doing things. Let's take in particular architects, because what you guys demonstrated there was the very snappy way that one can appraise a site and do massing studies and import, you know, parametric design and all these sort of what is still regarded as slightly whiz-bang things, but it's coming, and you're demonstrating that the application of it. So if you're an architect very used to using, let's say, Autodesk CAD systems, does VUCITY allow them to very easily jump between the two, as it were?
It does, yeah. So apologies with the short time we have today. It's difficult to show all of the tools that are within VUCITY, but absolutely you can. You can export from, you know, SketchUp, Rhino, AutoCAD, you know, Revit, any of the sort of standard packages that the architects would be working in, or other design professionals. You can export and then import directly into VUCITY, so a geolocated scale model. So we can add a lot more detail to those buildings. I mean, what we're looking at today is that kind of just initial ideas of appraisals around the site. Of course, once you start to understand it, then that's really where the design professionals come into play, because, you know, now we've got should we say, a more established brief about what a site may accommodate and how big that could be and what it would do. Yes, absolutely. And the links into and out of the kind of BIM type software are firmly established, and we have a lot of architects using the VUCITY platform as well.
Yes, Daniel, I see we've had a question about structured finance, which is definitely in your court. Do you want to field that one?
Yeah, definitely. I just saw that one pop up from Ricardo. So absolutely. My background before starting the company was as a development finance banker, lending money on development. So it's actually been built with the structured finance in mind. I mean, just to give you a very quick example to answer the question, I'll just jump over to Aprao here, and you can see that we put in a very high level assumption on senior debt for the particular appraisal, which is broken down as such. But when I collapse that, you can see a breakdown of your total costs, your total borrowing, and your developer's equity going in. But we can actually continue adding in as many lenders into the mix as we need to. There's no limit here. As well. So we could introduce a £1 million mezzanine loan, for example, with interest on the full loan amount charged at 1% per month. And that's going to be over a 36-month term as well. So we can choose things like whether your interest is retained, rolled up, or serviced. And we can also play around with the fees, adding and removing as many fees as necessary. And we can even work on the basis of things such as profit shares. So we can have as many lenders in the mix as we need to make the funding as accurate as possible. And when it comes down to the cash flow, our software will look at the priority of the lenders. So here we can adjust the order and the priority using these arrows. And it will basically make sure that the developer's equity and any mezzanine is going in at the beginning of the project, along with any senior debt to maybe contribute towards a site acquisition. Then generally the bank will fund the majority of the construction costs. And then at the end, it makes sure that the repayments happen in the order of those priorities or those charges that would be in place. So bank gets repaid first, and then a mezzanine or a second charge holder, and then finally the developer's equity. So you can model all of that out into Aprao and go into a lot of detail, even bringing in factors such as forward funding. So if you've got a affordable housing element which you'd like to exclude from the finance for the open market element, we can bring that in as well. So simple answer is yes.
Thank you. And I mean, looking ahead for both of you guys, I mean, to me, I recognize that, you know, your essential components of what could be that virtual initial project meeting where you've got a client at the head of the table and then the experts around the room, very quickly bringing their expertise to bear. And everything that you guys are doing is taking a lot of the sort of donkey work that normally they'd have to do when they go back to the office and, you know, come back, and then the iterative process begins, and weeks, sometimes months go by. A lot of what you guys are articulating, you know, could really fast track that whole process about, for a client and indeed the design team, is this a goer or not? So could you give us a clue of who else you might want to collaborate with moving forward?
Daniel, shall I pick up on that first?
Yeah, you can go first.
You're absolutely right, Dom. I mean, we don't see ourselves as the only players here at all. And in fact, the work we've been looking at with others, you know, from either thinking about the intelligence around the site as well. So one of the things that we can see that would add significant weight to this is when you start to think about, if I select a site and we use that red line poly from LandReg, for instance, if we could actually understand all of the pertinent planning data and everything else around that site, that would be really helpful too. So to that end, we've done an integration piece, which isn't launched yet, but will be in the new year, with Urban Intelligence. So they then, they've digitized all of the planning policy and all the details around sites, so that they can also help inform, you know, the potential of what you could do with a site before we even start to model up and look at, you know, the scale of schemes and what you could do. There's also then, I mean, there's free modeling software out there, panoramic software, you know, in so much as Prism, for instance, and Prism 2, so you could use parametric modeling. But there are others that are also dealing with this, you know, sites off from Ramble and others that we've been talking to, so that then actually you could then say, well, actually, let's get to a quick result in terms of maybe the best 100 solutions on a site, you know, and then from those start to select and use the appraisals to deliver results. So absolutely, this is, for me, is an ecosystem which we're just component parts, albeit, you know, fairly large players in that ecosystem. And, you know, having modelled the entirety of London, I think, you know, gives us a great starting point and an advantage from maybe other models that might exist. And that fluency of use is obviously hugely important to us. But I'd encourage anybody who feels that they can be part of that, you know, kind of PropTech solution, to get in touch and come and talk to us, because it's an evolving space, and always keen to talk to others and think about integrations.
Sure, and I guess for Daniel, as you know better than anyone else, the two big variables in any residual land valuation, of course, your expected receipts, you know, the ultimate value, and of course the costs and build costs, etc. Lots of noise around that at the moment. I guess you'd be particularly keen to hear from the big firms of QSs, perhaps, as to how, you know, you could develop some sort of plug-in with them.
Yeah, definitely. So you're right there, Dominic. The two key variables and the things that a lot of people are making assumptions on are the sales values or the disposal values, as well as the costs involved. And any way that we can speed up the appraisal process, I mean, we've already made massive time savings for a lot of people, but any way that we can continue to improve that, the better, really. So integrations, whether that's with data that's coming from QSs in terms of live or real build cost data, that's great, or sales values, for example, as well. I think the only issue with build cost data is it's relatively difficult to get hold of very good quality build cost data, because there's not really been too many standardized formats for that, but there's definitely a shift into that direction. So I can see within time that's the kind of thing that we would be integrating in to streamline that process even further.
Yeah, sure. We've had a question, I guess, which is for Jason in particular, from Alexis, saying, would you need a design specialist or even architect technician to fully understand the VUCITY software? If not, do you provide support in learning and product fully?
So the answer is no, you don't. You don't need to be a specialist, and you don't need to be an architect to use VUCITY. We do offer training and support, naturally, as you would expect, with the sort of products and software we use. So no, on that early stage of being able to select sites and look at opportunities, absolutely not. Of course, what we're doing with VUCITY is we're not removing the necessity from an architect and the design professionals to be engaged and involved. But if you're trying to find sites and understand where opportunities exist, no, quite frankly, you can use VUCITY right out of the box and away you go.
Yeah, good. And you've already mentioned the Prism system, and I saw we've got Ricardo on this call. Yeah. And of course that and other systems out there, particularly when it comes to residential, you can start using some standardized flat layouts and this sort of thing. And some people get a bit worried that that means it becomes very automated, the whole design, and the design flair gets taken out of it. But equally, and being a residential development man myself, I, along with lots of people, would recognize there is a lot of standardization around. And, you know, as Daniel mentioned, on this site, we're looking at an average unit size of 750 square foot. And we all know, you know, with a typical mix of units, what we're looking at. And of course, there are London design minimum design sizes, etc., that need to be applied. So you can start automating some of this, a lot of people would argue, including me, without taking away the need and respect the need for design flair to go on top of that. And of course, something we've discussed, Daniel, is when it comes to residential, getting very granular around unit sizes and mix is not that difficult when you're working in this world. And of course, it can give you very meaningful and detailed appraisal very early on to reflect, let's say, in the resi world, the number of 1, 2s and 3 bedrooms. And in some boroughs, we know there are guidelines you have to follow about the amount of family housing, and indeed, let's say, parking. The need to provide in some boroughs 0 parking, where it gets a red herring, but in others you do need to provide. So depending on the number of units and type of units, the number of parking spaces you need, where that goes, how that's designed in, etc., etc. A lot of this stuff can happen at this desktop level to give the developer, the design team, and indeed the engagement with the planners, or indeed the GLA moving forward, a really detailed view of what the ultimate scheme might look like. So if you've got any thoughts about how you'd like to engage with everyone out there to help these initial appraisals be as meaningful and as accurate as possible.
Yeah, it's a good point, Dominic. And I think the important thing with what we've created is we've not created a rigid system, but we've created a framework. So it allows people to work how they want to work within existing processes, apply their existing processes to it, but also customize it to the specific use case. So with what we've created, you can do very quick high-level appraisals like we've seen today, but you can also go very, very granular into a lot of detail. And again, it depends on where a customer is. So, you know, a lot of the things mentioned there are very London-centric, but we've obviously got customers in a lot of different geographies. So we've got to be able to build software that works for as many people as possible, but being able to quickly and easily split those breakdowns is really important. So we've got some great ideas in the pipeline as to how to even further take that sales information and split it accordingly, to play around with those different splits, to run those quick scenarios. I mean, today I showed how we went from a mixed use development to a pure commercial development as a very simple high level approach, but actually we want to be able to take that to the next level, even within just a couple of clicks.
It's probably worth touching on as well, Dom, with the models that we've created. I mean, within London, we've got 28 of the local authorities now adopting VUCITY as well. So, you know, when we think about where do we take this through, and you start to look at sites and opportunities and what could be built on them, of course, very quickly your mind starts to turn to the planning process. And then you think, well, you know, that's pre-apps and everything else. Knowing that there's, you know, a validation of the VUCITY as a platform to be able to then go and have those pre-app discussions, I think is really pertinent. And we have 5 UK cities now as well taking on the models that we've built of the 20, you know, and I can only see that growing. You know, I think there's a necessity. We all know this sort of, you know, the pressures on housing and building housing and finding the sites to build them on is one of the things that hopefully this does, rather than supersede the sort of design and intelligence that needs to go into sites, is to try and get sites to come forward quicker and understand what the opportunities they present and whether they're viable. And therefore, if all of those things can be, you know, organized and sorted much quicker, then actually we get down to spending more time on the creative response to what those schemes would look like and how they work. And I think that for me is really important, that we kind of look at that as the whole picture, really.
Yeah, it's a good point. And of course, with the now sort of emerging trend for much more transparency about the development process, particularly when it comes to joint ventures between public sector and private sector, you can see that in due course there could be sort of public consultation processes where it's explained, you know, the money go round is explained to the general public at large, respecting their intelligence, that this is why a scheme has to have this or that. So the former sort of dark arts around appraisals and the calculation of affordable housing, all those things much criticised, rightly so, you can see that this forms part of an ecosystem that promotes clear transparency for everyone's benefit moving forward.
Yeah, an interesting point. Yeah, go on, sorry, Daniel.
I was just going to say I agree with that, and we've seen that in our customer base. We've seen it where we've got people like architects, for example, are now creating more appraisals than they were before because they need to prove the financial viability, because previously there was lots of sites being designed which were uncommercial and never got built because the planning it was not a commercial scheme. So the importance of proving that commercial viability is really important, and we're seeing that just from our customer base and the type of appraisals that are being done throughout the design process.
I think it's a really interesting point that we do here, you know, in consultation. So VUCITY is already being used by people like Commonplace as part of their digital consultations for clients, and there's a particular scheme that's just coming to a conclusion for the consultation on the Olympic Park, for instance, being run by LLDC, but with Commonplace as the digital provider and VUCITY adding the content. It would be really interesting to think that then, you know, in time you start to, as you say, put the metrics around not only actually the appraisals around sites, but I think, you know, at some point there should be more open levels of transparency around SIL and everything else. Don, I don't know how you feel about, you know, do we stymie as well? It's always going to be a challenge, isn't it, around how much information you put out. But I do feel that sometimes development gets such a bad name and there's no understanding and representation of actually what it can add into communities, and things like SIL and those levies and things. You know, maybe we should be showing more of what that means.
Well, I think we're all agreeing. The answer is, you know, that the door's already open to all of that, and it's never going to close now. I think it's only going to get more open. It needs to, and the development market or developers, I think, are increasingly waking up to their responsibilities, be it around sustainability or just pure transparency generally. So, I mean, a lot of what you guys are about, I think, can ride that wave very well.
Yeah, for sure.
Definitely, definitely. Well, look, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. I would like to say a massive thank you to Jason and Dominic for joining us today in this webinar. If anyone's got any questions, we're going to be emailing everyone as a follow-up afterwards. So feel free to reach out to either any of us with any questions that you've got. And yeah, most importantly, thank you for joining us.
Yes, thanks everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Daniel. Bye, Don.
Bye.